good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever it is for you. My name is Lisa Whitehead, and I will be your professor for Biology 205, which is Anatomy and Physiology 1. I am so glad you're here. You're going to have so much fun with this course. Let's get going. If you haven't already, please go into our Blackboard website, and on the left you'll notice a tab that's the second from the top, and it's titled FAQ/Information. And so once you've selected that and you're into that page, please select the very first posting, which is called Video Lecture Syllabus. Please watch that first for important highlights about our syllabus for our course. In all of our lectures, I'm going to structure things in the same way. It's going to be set up with an outline at the very beginning that looks like this, and you'll see a whole list of enumerated topics. And this correlates with exactly what's happening in your chapter in sequential order. And I've set it up this way for your ease of studying because I recognize that you may be running to do an errand and trying to fit your studying in between a number of different interruptions. So hopefully with these headings, you'll be able to remember if you were in section 1.4 or 1.7, and you can always pick up where you left off, or alternatively, you can always easily return to an area to review it. So we're going to progress through the chapter in order, starting out first with an introduction, and then we'll have a study approach discussion. We'll move into section 1-2, which is the anatomy and physiology component, and the short of it is that anatomy is short for structure, and physiology is short for function. Then we'll discuss the levels of organization in the human body, and then move into a discussion of medical terminology and then anatomical terminology. Then we'll discuss the body cavities, then homeostasis, and last, in section 1-8, we'll discuss negative and positive feedback cycles. A major component of our lecture course is Mastering Anatomy and Physiology, which is offered through the Pearson website, and Pearson is the publisher for our major textbook, Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology. So what you're going to want to do is, following the instructions that are posted on our website under FAQ/Information, you'll see a page called MAP, which is Mastering Anatomy and Physiology, Registration Instructions. Please follow those because they have important information there. But the short of it is this. You're going to the website listed here on the left, masteringanp.com with a slash, and then what you're going to do is you're going to set up your account. You're going to need your student ID, and you're going to need to be sure that you enroll with your name as you are registered in the class. So you're going to be selecting your course ID, and it will be one of the two that you see here, either Whitehead 91208 if you're in the online anytime course, or Whitehead 53333 if you're in the online scheduled course. So you're going to be completing a number of open book quizzes in Mastering Anatomy and Physiology, and it's a wonderful program because there are these great dynamic study modules that prepare you for the quiz. But of course the quizzes are open book, so that's easy enough. But the point is I want you to learn it. So if you do the dynamic study modules, it's one more pass the material in a really learner-friendly way. So please take advantage of those even though they're not graded. But the quizzes, which are graded, are all going to be due Monday by midnight. So that means the very first one, which will cover chapter 1 in our textbook and the content therein, on Monday coming up. So you have about 6 days considering our week is a little short this week, but that's okay because this is the lightest chapter in the whole book by a very large margin. Now let's discuss how to approach this content. Your chapter offers some ideas, but I have some ideas for you too that I think will be helpful, and they're based off of experience with previous students. We're also going to discuss learning outcomes now. More learning outcomes include to utilize anatomical terminology, including planes, sections, regions, and relative position, be able to relate the directional positional terms to one another, define the terms from Lab 1 in our Bio 205 lab packet, and these terms include anterior and posterior, ventral dorsal, superior inferior, cephalic caudal, medial lateral, proximal distal, supine prone, and superficial and deep. In sectional anatomy, this includes sagittal, mid-sagittal or median, frontal or coronal, and transverse and oblique. And also to know the abdominopelvic quadrants and regions, as well as the organs that are in each of those areas. We'll have you identify the major body cavities and their subdivisions, so that's broken down to include dorsal, cranial, spinal, ventral, thoracic, abdominopelvic, pericardial, pleural, and peritoneal. And then lastly, to describe serous membrane structure, which includes identifying specific serous membranes, so that includes the pleural, pericardial, and peritoneal membranes, to list their location as well as their function, and to describe the location of the retroperitoneal organs and identify the difference between parietal and visceral layers. At the beginning of every lecture, you're going to see a couple slides that are listed like this. They're called learning outcomes. And this is the content that is testable. So you can think of the learning outcomes as a study guide because all of the stuff you're tested on derives from these learning outcomes right here. So let's go through them together. So the first is define anatomy and physiology and describe various specialties of each discipline. List the functional hierarchy of organismic structure all the way from atoms through to organism, and then be able to provide an example of each of those different levels. To identify the 11 organ systems, their overall functions, and name their associated major organs. Describe how the function of homeostasis works and what its significance is. Relate how negative feedback and positive feedback are involved in homeostatic regulation. Apply these terms and give examples of each. Explain the difference between intrinsic, such as autoregulation, and extrinsic regulation. Define stimulus, receptor, control center, effector, and set point, and then list what structures can act as effectors, and demonstrate anatomic position. I understand that very many of you who are registered in this class have already taken an anatomy and physiology course before, so you're feeling really well prepared, and I am so glad for that. But regardless of whether or not you've taken an A&P course before, you haven't taken this one, I'm presuming, which is a 200 level transfer level course that is the same whether you take it here or at the University of Chicago. So that means this is dense, it moves fast, there's a lot of content. It's not hard, but there's a lot and it just keeps building. So please study in this format and you'll find that this is the very best way that you can get what you need out of this course. Now that said, you can always do more, but this is the bare minimum of what you'll need to do. So before you even start considering the content of a specific week, please take a look at the chapter summary at the very beginning of the chapter. It gives you the very brief highlights of what you're actually going to learn in this chapter. So then you're going to want to sit down and focus and read the entire textbook chapter carefully, right? So once you go through all of that, you're probably going to want to go back a second time, at least at the minimum, and take notes. And so the notes you're taking are going to be highlighting things that you've learned, things that you're not quite understanding that you need to come back on, highlight the things that you need to focus on and reread, because you're going to want to read this several times to feel comfortable with it before you watch the lecture. So then you're going to go to our quote-unquote class, which is of course online in this format that you're seeing now. So when you're watching the video lecture, you're going to want to take notes of any area that you don't really feel confident in, and then be sure to ask for clarification. You can either email me, or if you want to ask a friend or anything at all, but just please refer to your notes or do something to make sure you get clarification on those areas, and don't put it off to the following week. Make sure you address it during the week that we're studying the content so that you don't forget it, because like I said, the content does build and I wouldn't want you to miss anything important. So then after our class, which is after you've watched the lecture, you're going to want to reread the chapter 2 more times. And that might seem insane. This is a lot of content and this will make sense to you as the semester goes on, I'm sure of it. You'll want to review your lecture notes. You'll probably want to rewrite them out another couple times because that action of writing down things over and over in your own words is a really great way to help you actually remember it and understand it and not just try to memorize it. And you're going to want to re-summarize your notes so that way when you're going to study for the upcoming exam, you'll have something neat and legible that you can refer to help refresh yourself. And then I always tell students, please be sure that you get a really good night's sleep the night before the exam. I've always thought it's a great idea to wake up early before an exam if you want to refresh yourself, but if you stay up all night getting no rest whatsoever, I can assure you, you will not be at the top of your game. It sounds like the right thing to do if you really feel like you've got to learn as much as possible, but I really do advocate go to sleep and wake up really early if you need to cram in a couple extra hours just beforehand. Now let's look at Chapter 1, Section 2, Anatomy is Structure and Physiology is Function. When we talk about anatomy, what we're really talking about is the basic structure of things. So as you can see here on the left, we have a picture of gross anatomy, which is what things look like with the naked eye. So this is an image of the cervix, and you can see here that it is nice and glossy pink, shiny, and there's a little erythema or redness around the cervical os or opening. And this is just what you would see if you're doing a typical pap smear or looking at a cervix through colposcopy. And so gross anatomy is performed at either a regional, systemic, or surface level. And we take things one step further when we look at histology, which is the study of tissues. So what we're looking at in this image here is a cross-section of a biopsy of this exact same type of tissue. So up where it says superficial, that is at the top of the tissue, and then we go further down deeper into the intermediate tissue, and then even further deeper into the parabasal epithelium. And this is all just different levels of the epithelium that we're looking at here. And if we want to go one step further, looking a little bit more closely, we have to look at things at the cellular level, not at the tissue level where we have architecture. At the cellular level, all we have are just random cells. So what we have here on the right is what we would call a cytology specimen, or actually a pap smear. So it's just a whole bunch of cells without any structure whatsoever, but we get to see what cells are at that most superficial layer, so we can identify if there's any pathology present. Physiology is effectively the function, which is different than anatomy, which is just the structure. So when we talk about the physiology, we are talking about how something works. We can look at this in a number of different ways. We can study it at a molecular level, which includes atoms and molecules. We could look at it at a cellular level, which includes how cells function and interact with one another. Or we could look at this in a more systemic approach in the way that different organ systems relate to one another. Next is Chapter 1, Section 3, Levels of Organization in the Human Body. When we talk about how the body is organized, we'll start at the smallest level and then build up to the largest level. So the smallest is the chemical level and the largest is the organismal level. And the organismal level comprises organisms as you know them, like a human or a dog or a piece of seaweed, for example. So the chemical level will include atoms, and then a number of atoms together can form DNA and eventually form a cell. So with a cell, eventually you will have multiple cells together that will go from being an individual cell to forming an entire tissue in which you have multiple cells of the same type functioning together for a same purpose. And then tissues of several sorts will all work together in an organ for the same function. So for example, as you see here, the urinary bladder is an organ, but there are several different types of tissues involved in that organ. So in the urinary bladder, there is the epithelium, which lines the superficial aspect, or the interior lining, if you will, of the bladder. But there's also a muscular layer too, which helps the bladder expand and contract as the contents expand with greater fluid content, right? And then further, we have an organ system. So if we take that one step further, the urinary bladder, which is an organ, will also have a relationship with the kidneys, which produce urine, and the ureters, which transport urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, and then the urethra, which helps to excrete the urine too. So the organ system includes the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. And then one step beyond that is the organism. And at the organismal level, the organisms have a whole number of different systems. So for example, in humans, we have a digestive system, we have a urinary system, an endocrine system, a nervous system, etc., etc. Let's start with the lowest level of organization, the chemical level. So you probably recall that atoms and molecules are different, that atoms are the smallest possible unit of an element, whereas molecules will comprise two or more atoms bonded together. So when we talk about atoms, we'll talk about their subatomic particles sometimes, which include electrons, neutrons, and protons. When we talk about molecules, because we're talking about two or more atoms bonded together, we're talking about a more complicated substance. So these organic molecules will contain carbon, with the exception of CO and CO2. And also keep in mind that some of the larger organic molecules that you'll commonly find are going to be starches, glycogens, fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. Moving up one step is the cellular level of organization. So when we look at cells, like what you see in the image on the right, you're looking at the smallest possible unit of life. There is such a thing as a single cellular organism. So these are surrounded by a plasma membrane, and that plasma membrane is important because it creates a distinct boundary with the outside world. And we'll use the expression selectively permeable a lot throughout this course. And that's really important because these cells are not just letting things pass through the membrane without any discrimination. They are going to have very specific criteria by which certain elements can pass through both in and out of that membrane, and that will change everything. We'll cover this in a whole lot more detail coming up. Now, organelles are like organs in that they are part of an overall structure and they have a specific purpose, but because we're only talking about a single cell and not a whole organism, they have a very specific job only within the cell. So for example, when we talk about cytoplasm, which is the general space that is around the nucleus, inside the cell, surrounded by the plasma membrane, it's filled with a fluid, and that fluid has a functional role, and that fluid is called cytosol. So one level of organization more complicated is the tissue level. There are 4 primary types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And the epithelial type of tissue is present in a lot of places you may not expect. So it covers our external body, so all of our skin is epithelial or epithelium, and it also lines anything in our body that has contact with the outer world. So for example, our entire digestive tract is lined with an epithelium, which is important because the epithelium is capable to respond to external insults. And something that's interesting to discuss here is the clinical correlation of chemotherapy. So chemotherapy effectively endeavors to attack the cells in a cancer that are replicating very quickly. Now, unfortunately, we have cells in our body that replicate rather quickly, and our hair cells, for example, are at the hair glands, and also our digestive tract epithelium also replicates rather quickly. So while the chemotherapy is effective at slowing down cancer growth, it also can negatively affect other normal structures in our body, like our GI system and our hair production. Okay, another type is the connective tissue. Now, connective tissue will have fewer cells, but it produces matrix. And matrix is very important because it is essentially the scaffold that allows the connective tissue to build upon. There's also muscular tissue. So muscle tissue is going to shorten with force, and that allows us to produce movement. So let's say the biceps on my right arm here is going to contract as I bring my hand up to my shoulder. So that muscle tissue is very important to allowing me to actually move my arm. And then lastly, we have nervous tissue, which carries action potentials, which is responsible for initiating movement and a variety of other things. So the lovely image you see here is taken from an autopsy. So you can see that fresh tissue is very colorful, and oftentimes the images that you're going to see in a textbook are going to be kind of gray because they're tissues that have been fixed in formalin or formaldehyde for quite a while. So when we talk about the organ level, we're talking about a minimum of 2 or more tissues, but usually there's all 4, that are all coordinating to do a specific job. So for example, let's talk about your stomach. Your stomach is lined with epithelium, right? And then it also has a muscular layer, which allows it to expand and contract in response to the contents within it. And there's also connective tissue, and there is also nervous tissue there, which helps to stimulate the stomach to contract or produce cholecystokinin after a meal, for example. So basically all 4 types of tissue are present in the stomach, but they're all coordinating together to function as one. Organ systems are slightly more complicated in that they include at least 2 or potentially more organs. So for example, our digestive system is going to include a whole number of different parts, right? There is the mouth, there's the esophagus, the stomach, the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, colon, rectum, and anus, all as part of the digestive system. So you can see that there's a lot involved in one particular organ system. So please take a look at your textbook because they have some beautiful images that show you what these different organ systems are. In Biology 205, we are covering basically command and control. So we will discuss in the beginning some very basic foundational information that you need to understand before we progress. But once we get past that foundational information, we're going to talk about the systems that command and control the whole body. So the integumentary system is basically skin. And then we have the male and female reproductive system, the nervous system, and the endocrine system that are part of what we're going to study in this course. A&P2 gets super interesting because now you get to dive into all the systems that I think you'll relate to a little bit better. You start talking about the urinary system, the lymphatic, respiratory, digestive, cardiovascular, skeletal, and muscular systems. So this is where it gets super fun. Now, that said, you won't understand or succeed very well in this course if you don't do well and learn everything in the A&P 1. So let's focus on what we need to learn here in this course first. Now let's discuss Chapter 1, Section 4, Medical Terminology. So let's discuss anatomical position. Anatomical position is, as you see on the right, if somebody were to stand up with their arms fully extended, their palms facing forward, and their feet together, just standing completely straight, aligning on the side, your ear over your shoulder, over your hip. This is our anatomical position, and it's important because it gives us a frame of reference to describe things to different people. So for example, stand in anatomic position for a moment. Now then, with your arms, just drop them and relax them in the way that you would normally stand, right? So if you look at the way your arms are now, they're very different than anatomical position, and everybody stands a little bit differently. So anatomical position gives us a reference point by which I can say that something was on the right medial forearm, which could literally be the right lateral forearm if the person was standing in anatomical position or just totally relaxed. So that's why we always use this orientation every time we're talking about a patient unless otherwise designated. Now we're going to go a little deeper in depth with terminology in section 1-5, anatomical terminology. So once a patient is assumed to be in anatomical position, we can then go on to describe where a specific lesion may be, for example, such as if the patient had a black, irregular, rapidly growing, and bleeding ulcer on their right forearm. We'd want to be able to know exactly where that is and then, of course, treat it accordingly. So we use these terms as follows. So prone is laying with your face down, so it's on your stomach or your abdomen. And then supine is going to be when you're lying but face up. And I always think of this in terms of you can't have soup when you're prone, right? You can't lay on your stomach and eat soup. So supine to eat soup. Anterior is in front of you. Posterior is anything towards the back, behind. Ventral is belly and dorsal is backside. Now, if you ever get confused between these two, you could probably think of fishing, or maybe somebody's gone snorkeling at some point and you see a fish, and the ventral fin is going to be on the belly or the abdomen, and the dorsal fin is the traditional big shark fin from Jaws, if any of you are old enough to know what that is. Then we have proximal and distal. Proximal just means it's closer to than a reference point, and distal is the opposite. It's just this is further from the point of initial attachment. But wait, there's more. Sometimes we need to refer to something a little more specifically. So we might say something is superior, meaning up. We can also use words like cephalic or cranial, which both basically mean referring to the head. And then we have inferior, which is basically caudal, and caudal is meaning literally to the tail. And then below. Medial is anything that's towards the midline. So your umbilicus, for example, is in your medial abdomen. And by contrast, your sides are lateral, away from the midline. Internal is going to be anything deep, and superficial is going to be towards the exterior of the body. So anytime you're talking about something on the exterior of the body, you always have to give a reference point in some other way, because it could be in any of 360 degrees, right? So superficial is skin, and as let's say somebody gets an injection, it goes from superficial to deep. And that doesn't matter whether it's on somebody's forearm, the back of their hand, their jugular vein, does not matter. That's always going from external to internal. Lastly, we divide the body into two different main categories. And one is your axial skeleton, and the other is your appendicular. So the axial skeleton will consist of only your head, neck, and trunk, which is what you'll see in the image to the right as the skeleton, that is the axial skeleton, is in blue. Now appendicular is easy to remember because it's basically your appendages, right? So your arms and legs are your appendages. And so those bones are the ones that are considered the axial skeleton. So you can see those in beige in the image to the right. Okay, so here's a fun one, and this is the sort of thing that might come up on an exam. So do this along with me for a moment if you don't mind. So stand up in anatomical position. So remember that that's standing facing forwards, ankles fairly together, and your palms facing forward. Okay? So when you stand like this, now bend your left arm at the elbow so that your fingers are pointing totally superiorly or up. Okay? So now what part of your hand is facing anteriorly? Okay, so when you're looking at these different options, what you want to think about is in anatomical position. If you put your hand back there for a moment, remember where that is, right? So when you're in the pose that this question asks, your palm is facing posteriorly, right? And so the dorsal side of your hand is actually facing anteriorly. Because when you put that hand back into anatomic position, the back of your hand is facing posteriorly. This information is going to be very helpful to those of you who are going to be interacting in any way with radiology or even sending your patients for imaging studies, because you're going to be hearing a lot of these terms when they have to position the patient a certain way to see something. So first off, the difference between a plane and a section. So if you want to just imagine that there's a line through somebody, as you would if you were looking at an image of somebody on a computer screen, on a PAC station specifically in radiology, that would be a plane, because nobody's actually come along and cut the person in half, right? So it's just an imaginary line. Now a section, by contrast, is different. A section basically means that a cut has been made along a plane. So for example, if I were to give you a loaf of bread and you took a knife and you cut slices of bread off of the giant loaf, well then in that case you are cutting along a certain plane. Okay, just all those cuts are going to be perpendicular to one another, and that's a section. Okay, so then we have a few other terms we need to think about. So we can divide the body into right and left halves by sagittal or parasagittal planes. Similarly, mid-sagittal is basically taking that same sagittal line that runs from superior to inferior right down the middle of the body. That mid-sagittal is actually going to be right down the total dead center middle of our body, whereas sagittal is doing that same line except moving over laterally. So it can still divide the body into right and left, but it is parasagittal. Now there's the frontal or coronal plane, which is going to divide the body into front and back, okay, the anterior and posterior. The transverse plane is the one that cuts the body in half at the waist. So the transverse section is the one that magicians would always pretend to do in, cutting some, lovely lady in a box, right? So that's the transverse plane. And then the oblique plane is any other angle really of division, and that can be altered accordingly to what's needed. So we'll also break down different body parts into quadrants, because that helps us to have a general reference point when we're talking about if somebody comes into the hospital and they complain of abdominal pain. Well, that could mean a whole lot, right? The abdomen covers a lot of different organs underneath that skin. So if we are able to say, well, what quadrant is it? People can usually imagine a board that's basically like a big plus sign down their midline and cutting across at the umbilicus. I think they can all imagine that for the most part, or at least they can point to where it is. And that gives us a reference point that we might know it might be appendicitis, or it certainly could not be appendicitis. Is this a medical emergency or not? This information will be helpful. So the quadrants are simple. Right is right and left is left, right? And then we just have upper and lower. So there's the left upper quadrant and then the left lower quadrant. Same thing on the right side. Okay, and then these quadrants are also used very frequently when we're assessing breast cancers, in which we'll divide the breast into the same exact plus sign, and that plus sign will meet at the nipple at the midsection of it. And that divides the breast into the quadrants, so that way we can know, for example, if a patient appears with a lump in the upper outer quadrant, in that case, it's more likely to potentially be a malignancy. Or it could be a lymph node, because there are more lymph nodes up towards the axilla or underarm. So these quadrants are going to be important for you to use in your profession. So now we'll get a little bit more specific. Quadrants are really helpful in order to determine where something might be in general, but we'd like to get a little more specific to figure out what really might be happening for this patient who comes in with abdominal pain. So take your tic-tac-toe board and basically with your hands you can imagine where those lines would be on you. And then you can take that chart that you see on the left and superimpose it mentally on the one on the right and figure out that if somebody had pain in a certain area, what could it possibly be? What could it not be? One of the things you'll notice is that the GI system is pretty much everywhere, right? Between the stomach, which is taking up quite a lot of the upper aspect of the left hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, even dipping down into the umbilical a little bit and into the left lumbar. So that's a lot of space for the stomach to be taking up. But the colon and small intestine takes up a ton of different spaces too. So just sort of play with that in your mind and try to get used to what might be where. So if I were to ask you, what most likely would be causing pain in either the right inguinal or left inguinal region, if you were to look at the image on the right, what you would guess is, well, that's either colon or small bowel, depending on how you follow it with your eye. But basically, that would be the idea. If you were to say liver, no, right? Like the liver would not be in that location. The liver should be up much more superior than that. Now let's look at Chapter 1-6, body cavities. Body cavities are going to be cavities that are truly closed and they're fluid-filled spaces, and they have an incredible importance in our body that you don't think about until something goes wrong with it. So they allow for movement. So just by having these cavities, having some fluid, it allows that organ inside to change in shape. So think about the heart, how it changes every time it pumps, right? It definitely has a cavity around it that allows it to expand and contract easily like that. And then secondly, that fluid is going to be really helpful because it prevents organ damage from shocks and impacts. So without it, if there was just air, hypothetically, just slapping our organs around inside of us, they'd be damaged left and right. However, with this fluid that we have in all of our cavities, that little bit of fluid helps tremendously to cushion the blows. So let's talk a little bit more about what a serous membrane really is. So I love this image here down below that you can see, in which you have a person taking their fist and putting it into basically what would be a water balloon, more or less. And you see that cushioning that all that water around that fist would have, right? So that helps you understand why it's important that we have that padding there. And then also, if you can imagine now that that fist is your heart pumping and just sort of make your fist contract and relax a couple times, you can imagine that that balloon over top of the fist would be changing considerably to allow for that movement inside. And that's exactly the case. So a serous membrane is a double layer membrane. And this is important because we have to have linings on two different areas here. And then we have a fluid in between them, okay? So the lining that's going to be on the visceral organs, our viscera, is the visceral serous membrane. And then we have something that's also more peripheral or outer, and that's the parietal serous membrane. Now, both of those are going to have fluid inside of them that is serous fluid. So if you were to think about it, if somebody were to take an injection into the pericardial heart cavity, which we'll get to in a moment, which is the cavity right around the heart, and drew fluid, you wouldn't expect to see any infectious material, any purulent material or pus, right? You would expect to see a clear red brownish fluid that would presumably be healthy, meaning the patient doesn't have pericarditis. So this is what you would normally expect with a healthy, normal serous membrane. So here's just a quick slide for your notes that differentiates the difference between parietal membranes from visceral membranes. So parietal membranes are the ones that are going to be peripheral and adherent to the body wall, whereas the visceral serous membranes are going to adhere directly onto the surface of the organ. So that's demonstrated really nicely in the image below. And serous fluid is the fluid that is there to prevent some friction or trauma. So it gives a little bit of space and allows for some movement and lubrication. So we have specific names for specific serous membranes, so we can refer to them individually. So the membranes that cover the lungs are the pleural membranes. Anything over the heart, around the heart is the pericardial cavity, so the pericardial membrane is what covers the heart. And then our peritoneum is basically covering our entire abdomen and abdominal organs. So that's our peritoneal serous membrane. And then we also have the mesentery, which is basically sheets of visceral peritoneum and adipose tissue kind of hanging down as a bit of a padding for our abdomen. So that is what is in between our abdominal wall and the actual contents of our GI system. So it's a nice little bit of protection so that our colon or small bowel isn't right up underneath our skin. So mucous membranes, they're totally different, right? This is epithelial tissue that creates a barrier to the outside world. So like we talked about before with the GI system, basically anything, any part of your GI system moving from proximal to distal, from the start of the line to the end of the line, all of that is epithelial tissue, and that will be mucous membrane because it has to be lubricated in order to allow food to pass, right? If it was totally dry, it would be absolutely terribly painful to have any digestive action at all. Okay, so the mucous membranes are going to produce mucus, right, which is kind of sticky, goopy saliva, for example, and that will contain enzymes. And those enzymes are really important because it also helps to digest and push things along the way. So we'll talk more about mucous membranes later on when we get to chapter 4. In the anterior or ventral cavity, basically we have three main subdivisions or cavities within the main ventral cavity. So the cavity is everything on your front, okay? So the three main cavities that are in the anterior ventral cavity are your thoracic, which is up by your lungs, right, in your chest, abdominal, and pelvic, okay? And so these are all lined by serous membranes, and most organs are surrounded by these membranes too. Now, retroperitoneal organs are not going to be completely covered. So the first thing I think about when I think about retroperitoneal organs is I think of the kidneys, right? Because they are not part of the general abdominal cavity. They are tucked away up and behind, kind of. So they're a little bit different. Those are retroperitoneal. So the thoracic cavity is the most superior of the cavities that are present on the ventral or anterior cavity, right? So we're going to separate the thoracic cavity, the most superior part, from the abdominal pelvic cavity below it by the diaphragm. So you can see in the images on the right that there's a red band that basically runs right around the bottom of the lungs, roughly around the bottom of your rib cage, and that is going to be our diaphragm. Okay, separating the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic cavities. And so the organs that are in the thoracic cavities are going to be our heart, lungs, trachea, esophagus. We've got everything up there, right? The large blood vessels coming out of the heart, the thymus. So then we're going to take it a little bit further and break that down into things that are a little more functionally relevant. So we have two pleural cavities inside the thoracic cavity. And that means we have two pleural cavities because we have two lungs. So there's one cavity for each lung. And then we have one pericardial cavity because we only have one heart, right? And then we also have the mediastinum, which is this area that's in the center of the thoracic cavity, and it contains a lot of things. There's the thymus, the trachea, the esophagus. So the trachea and esophagus run together, right, from superior to inferior. And then we also have large blood vessels that end at the heart that are all in that small space. So the pleural cavities are going to be part of the thoracic cavity, which is in the anterior cavity. So we're going to start off with, we have two cavities, one on the right, one on the left for each lung. And the pleural cavities totally surround each lung, and they're surrounded by this serous membrane, right? And the serous membrane has the two layers, and what we're talking about more specifically when we say what is the cavity is actually the space between the two layers of each pleural membrane. So you may not even really recognize that it's there because remember, there's the visceral membrane that's right on top of the viscera or the organ, and then there's the parietal or peripheral, that's what I think of in my head, the parietal membrane, which is on the chest wall. So the cavity is going to be that space in between those two layers, which can be, quite far apart as the lung breathes, for example, and there's space left, and it's going to expand and contract. The pericardial cavity is the cavity that surrounds the heart, and that's really important for providing lubrication to prevent friction of the heart against the pericardial wall, right? So we have that serous fluid in the pericardial cavity cushioning the heart as it pumps. And so one clinical correlation that's really interesting is something called cardiac tamponade. And cardiac tamponade is what you're going to see at the bottom right image. So that's an image showing a heart in its pericardial cavity in situ, the way it would look in the human body, right? But what you notice is right around the heart, you can see where it's red, dark, it looks like blood clot, and that's exactly what it is. So if there is a tear to one of the major vessels coming in or out of the heart, what can happen is blood can pump into the pericardial space, and with every contraction and relaxation, there's going to be more blood pooling into the pericardial membrane until basically there's so much blood around the heart in the pericardial cavity that there is physically no mechanical space for the heart to pump. And at which point then you have a mechanical distress which leads to myocardial infarction and probably death if it's not treated. So moving from the top to the bottom, we just discussed the thoracic cavity, and now we're moving to the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is exactly what it sounds like. It houses both the abdomen and the pelvis. So there is no physical separation between the abdominal aspect or abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. There's nothing there. They're just basically all coexisting together, and this is division for us to kind of separate what types of organs are present. And this abdominal pelvic cavity is lined by peritoneal serous membrane. So in the abdominal cavity, you'll also find mesentery. And what mesentery is basically when the visceral peritoneum basically grows between the loops of the intestine. So that's nice though because it helps house those blood vessels that are running from major vessels out to the more distal part of the GI tract. So the pelvic cavity is basically going to house everything that's between the bones of the pelvis. And it's not all just reproductive organs. There's also the bladder that's in it, as well as the most distal part of the GI system too. So we actually have a couple different things happening in the pelvis, aside from typical female reproductive organs such as ovaries, uterine or fallopian tubes, and the uterus, or in males you would expect to see a prostate and seminal glands or seminal vesicles, right? So the image that we're looking here at the left is showing you organs of the pelvic cavity on cross-section on a frontal plane. And what we're looking at is a cross-section of somebody as if they were standing facing towards your right. Okay, so on the anterior we see the bladder, and then up top center we see the uterus, and then the bottom part of the uterus where it's whitish, that's down towards the cervix. And then keep moving towards the left, which is the posterior aspect, that is going to be the rectum, and down lower you have the anus as well, and some of the sigmoid colon up towards the top or superior aspect of the image. So this is a surgery that was performed for a patient who had an invasive and very well progressed, unfortunately, case of cervical cancer. So you can see that whitish area in the center that radiates outwards into all different places. That is the primary cancer that has grown and spread into the uterus. It's grown into the walls of the bladder and of the rectum and anus, and it's grown all along the sides of the vagina too. So this is staged basically as highly as you can for level of invasion, and is done typically for palliation. So the dorsal cavity isn't really discussed very much in the text because it's not really commonly used, but nonetheless it is distinctly different from the ventral cavity, right? So the dorsal cavity is going to be everything that is along the most posterior part of your body, which is your cranial cavity around your brain, and then your vertebral cavity, which is down along your vertebral column. And it's the vertebral column that houses the spinal cord. So you can see why it'd be very important if somebody were to have, say, for example, an infection in those cavities around the brain and spinal cord, that would be meningitis, right? Okay, so here's a good question. So if a surgeon were to make an incision just inferior to the diaphragm, then which body cavity would be opened? So if you put your hand on your body where that is, and figure, okay, so is that in the pericardial cavity around my heart? No. Is it in the dorsal cavity around my brain or my vertebral column? No, we can rule that out too. And then it gets more tricky. Are we in the pleural cavity or the abdominal pelvic cavity? And so in the pleural cavity, that would be around the lungs, so we know that's not the case. But then the abdominal pelvic cavity, even though that's a very broad descriptor, that is what applies best to this question. We use a lot of acronyms in this class, and they are really helpful to get you to learn things. So if you come across one when you're studying, as long as it's, you know, PG rated because this is school, please feel free to post on the discussion board so your fellow students can see what it is. So when we're trying to figure out what are the retroperitoneal and infraperitoneal organs, then we have to use this acronym SAD pucker. So in this case, every letter stands for something. So the S is your suprarenal or adrenal glands. We usually say adrenal. The A is for your aorta and inferior vena cava, which are the two largest vessels in our body. D is for duodenum, but specifically the second and third segments. And so the duodenum is the part of the GI tract that is just distal or just beyond the stomach. Okay, then attached to the duodenum is the pancreas, which is important for its response to insulin. And then we have the ureters, and so the ureters are going to be coming from the kidneys, which are listed 2 down. So the ureters and the kidneys. And we also have a portion of the colon, specifically the ascending and the descending. And so the ascending is on the right, and the descending is on the left, okay? And then we have the esophagus, which is what takes food from your mouth and throat down to your stomach, and the rectum, which is the most distal point of our digestive system. All organisms that are alive have the same basic characteristics. They're all organized in one way or another. They all have a way of metabolizing energy, so that way they can continue to persist as organisms. They all must respond to their environment, right? So they have to maintain an internal environment. So typically they're trying to maintain a homeostasis. They're all going to grow and develop and eventually reproduce. Now let's look at Chapter 1, Section 7, Homeostasis. Homeostasis is essentially just the maintenance of a basic, stable internal environment. And so ideally what we want to sit around is a set point, And then there's such a thing as a dynamic equilibrium in which will fluctuate around the set point. So for example, your temperature isn't always going to be exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? It may be ever so slightly warmer after you've taken a jog, or it may be a little bit lower if you're feeling a little chilly because you've been outside for a while. But nonetheless, you basically fluctuate around a set point, and as long as it's within a normal range, that's just fine. That's a dynamic equilibrium. And that flux is important for life, right? We couldn't always stay at the exact same temperature and respond to our external environment in the same way. So we maintain our homeostasis by either a negative or positive feedback. And we'll talk more about this later on. The mechanisms of regulation can be broken down into two categories, either intrinsic or extrinsic. So intrinsic mechanisms are those that are automatic responses in the cell, tissue, or organ that respond to some environmental change totally on their own without any other feedback. Now, extrinsic regulation is a little different in that it involves the nervous and or the endocrine system's involvement. So in this case, a receptor would receive the stimulus. For example, if you were to touch something that's very sharp with your finger, so a nerve ending in your finger is the receptor, it receives the stimulus of something sharp, and then through your nervous system, you process the fact that this is sharp, I should pull my finger away from it, and of course you pull your finger away so as not to be injured. So that's an example of extrinsic regulation. The control center is going to be the site that processes the signal and then sends instructions back out to the peripheral area to respond. And the effector is what is effected by the control center. So the effector is effectively carrying out the instructions from the control center. So negative feedback occurs whenever you deviate from normal, and basically the set point has to be corrected to return to normal. So if you turn to your textbook, you'll see figure 1-8, which talks about controlling room temperature. And it's a really great graph because it gives you the idea that homeostasis is effectively normal room temperature, like 20 degrees Celsius or whatever that is in Fahrenheit. I'm Canadian. So either way, when things get a little too hot in the room in summer, the thermostat is going to sense that it's warm, and then that fires on the air conditioning. And so the air conditioning is the effector, and once it gets kicked in, then that restores temperature back to normal. So homeostasis is restored by decreasing the room temperature back to our homeostatic level. Now, alternatively, in winter, if things get a little too cold, that same thermostat can sense that it's cold, and the receptor, the thermometer, will determine that, okay, it's too cold, time to turn on the furnace. So in this case, homeostasis is disturbed because the temperature got too cold. So when it turns the thermostat back on, you get back to a normal homeostatic, normal room temperature. So like we just discussed in the previous slide, you can see here at the bottom right that the temperature should flux basically around a set point, which is our normal range. And so if the temperature gets too high in summer, then the air conditioner turns on. However, if the air temperature gets too cold, then the air conditioner turns off. And by a series of turning on and turning off, your air conditioner maintains your house at 70 degrees. So the major image on the left here shows you the control center, which is the thermostat, and it's responsible for sensing basically what the temperature is. So it sends commands to the effector. So the effector is the air conditioner in this example during the summer. And so the effector will turn on the air conditioner, and then the response is that the room temperature is going to drop once that air conditioner gets cranking. So then you have a nice normal temperature again, and things will settle down. Now, alternatively, what could happen is things can get a little too cool, at which point then the air conditioner will realize it's time to turn off. So this whole thing is a circle that goes around in a cycle over and over and over again in order to maintain homeostasis. So in humans, the homeostatic control of thermoregulation or temperature regulation is basically the same as what we just discussed with the air conditioner or furnace example in the previous slide. Except in this case, the control center is going to be a thermoregulatory center in our brains, and it's going to send commands to different parts of our bodies that help us cool down. So we don't have an air conditioner, but we do have sweat glands, and those sweat glands will produce fluid that will allow our skin to become wet and therefore have more evaporative cooling. It also allows our blood vessels at the superficial, most epithelial level to dilate or to get bigger. And so because of that, it allows more heat to transpire off of our skin into the ambient environment. So by those two mechanisms, the effectors are going to allow our normal temperature to be restored. So the response is we have increased heat loss and our body temperature drops, and we get back to homeostasis of a normal body temperature. Positive feedback is not something you're going to discuss a whole lot in healthcare because typically it's a harmful feedback cycle that you will not see too often. Probably the most common example that is not pathologic is going to be when a woman is in labor. Once the labor begins, then the contractions and the hormone cascade that occurs will promote increasing contraction speed, strength, and frequency. Okay, so that is one normal positive feedback loop. But there are other normal positive feedback loops, for example, in blood clotting. Now, the blood coagulation cascade, which you'll discuss in 206, is pretty complicated. But basically, once you have an injury, you need to stop bleeding, otherwise you'd bleed forever, right? So if you were to cut your skin, what happens is a number of platelets will be aggregated to the area and they create a clot, and a number of chemicals are released from those platelets that will help to seal off that wound so that way you don't bleed indefinitely. And then lastly, you have some normal positive feedback cycles in the female reproductive hormone cycle, and we will discuss those later. So this is a great example of positive feedback in the form of blood clotting. So starting on the left, you can see that there's damage to the tissue, right? So the blood vessel walls are going to release a number of different chemicals, and those are all going to start the process of blood clotting. And then once that starts, it keeps reinforcing to itself and building more and more. So the chemicals will start chain reactions in which cells and cell fragments and some proteins are all going to start dissolving in the blood, and those are beginning to form a clot. And then as the clotting continues, every step that occurs basically promotes the next step to help keep clotting. So the idea is that one little layer of blood cells is not going to be enough to stop a big wound, right? You need multiple layers. So you can see once you get to the far right image, you can see that the blood clot is many layers thick. And then once you get to a complete blood clot, believe it or not, these cells are able to tell themselves by a chemical communication that the job is done, that the bleeding has stopped, and so they can actually stop this process, which is really fascinating, and we will talk about this much more coming up. Okay, so here's a great question. So if you donate a pint of blood, we know that's going to reduce your blood volume, right? Because we've taken a pint of blood out of your body. So blood volume goes down, and that results in decreased blood pressure. So what effect does that have on the heart rate? So let's think about this for a second. So will the heart rate go up to compensate, or go down to compensate, or will there be no change? Well, there has to be some difference, right? Because we need to make sure that all of our tissues are oxygenated at all times. So we're going to expect a certain level of oxygenation. So if our blood pressure drops, then we are by default going to have to raise the heart rate in order to compensate. So let's take this question one step further. So what type of feedback is it when the heart rate has to go up to compensate for decreased blood pressure in response to reduced blood volume? Well, is this a positive feedback cycle? Because if it is, then we would expect that the heart rate would continue going up and up and up. Or by contrast, if the heart rate is only going up temporarily to address the decrease in blood pressure, then what we have then is a truly negative feedback cycle because we're trying to maintain a certain range, right? So negative feedback is best exemplified by thermal regulation, in which case basically our body does things to cool us down so that way we can return to a normal core set point. All right, everyone, thank you so much for your attention. I hope you've been interested in the very bare bones beginning of this course. I think you're going to love it. I will be posting these different lectures for you for each chapter, and they will all go up on the Monday at 9 a.m., for which they are the new topic of the week. So you can expect to see them posted regularly. If you have any questions, please contact me anytime. I'm here for you. I may not be in my office, but I am here. I will email, we will Zoom, and we will get you straightened out and moving forwards. So thanks again, everyone. I hope you're staying well. I hope your families are staying well, and I will hope to talk with you soon.